Welcome to Crossing Faiths. I'm John Pinna, and today we have a really special guest. I've been yelled at to not call her the Reverend Mother, even though you are a Reverend Dr. Marian
And a
Edmonds-Allen,
mother.
and a mother. So that's my dune. So it's something that's just comes out naturally. But you work at the intersection of faith and values and technology, and you're serving with the AI and spirituality initiative at the Neurospirituality Lab at Harvard University Medical School, and the senior advisor for Moral Compass at American Security Foundation, and you're also the executive director at Parity. And we, now that we're through like the formal titles, we met and had an instant chemical reaction at in Prague, and when we were at the faith-based or the multi-faith gathering that was held by Ambassador Rehak and the Czech government on freedom of religion and belief, and so kind of like a quasi ministerial or a quasi summit for international religious freedom, but it was a very high level sort of interaction of faith-based practitioners and subject matter experts to kind of talk about what the status was of religious freedom and religious persecution globally. And then I found out that you're involved on the AI perspective and a person of faith, and that's something that I've been working on with the International Religious Freedom Analyzer. So we've kind of had a number of conversations and chatted a little bit, and now we're kind of getting to a point where I was like, oh, I gotta have her on because you are so close in orbit to in the religious freedom space, dignity space, and you know AI, and I was like to think of you as in the center. There's a center of the universe. There's a sort of ball. And that speaks to humanity, and you're like right there listening to whatever that is, right? So in any event, thank you for coming on board and spending some time with me.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. And if there is a ball at the center of the universe speaking wisdom, you are that ball.
Oh gosh,
So
I appreciate you saying that, and but if that's the case, I mean, it would just be like, we just all need to have a meal, together,
great. Let's do it. Right? Yeah.
I'm not so sure like AI is the right thing, but Bob could diplomacy, which you're aware. I think I've sent
Which I
a bribe your
love.
way once
Oh
or
my
once or
gosh.
twice, and but AI is so interesting. I mean, the problem is I think before we started recording, I was saying it's like I get a lot of heat for using AI in this space because of how it affects the environment, and people
Mhm.
are very nervous about that. But you have to kind of weigh into that those waters because it is a tool. But so first, before we get going, maybe we just chat a little bit about who you are and why how you came to be in the AI space. Like what's that journey from faith-based leader working in the NGO world, working in civil society, and then sort of taking that step into this AI world where you're actually working very, very closely with, all the names in this space and particularly related to dignity, faith, spirituality, and helping vulnerable populations.
Well, I feel like it's been a blessed journey where I've met the most amazing people, and you're right at the top of the list. I think for me, it's been the company that I've kept over the years. I've been involved in covenantal pluralism circles, and the folks who are in those circles are deeply concerned about humanity in the world, about protecting the rights of all people, wherever they might be. And so the conversation within those circles quickly turned to AI as AI became more and more talked about in the news and more people understood what it was or what it could be. So these great folks that I've been working with then decided to put a lot of their energy towards AI and what it means in the religious freedom space and the human rights space. And I was invited to different things and just became more and more convinced that this is a big part of God's call on my life personally to be involved at this intersection. And as I'm learning and growing from the people that I'm interacting with, I'm just more and more convinced that this is a topic that every human person, see how it's changing the language. I would never have said human person before, but that every person should be thinking about from their perspective and thinking about like your colleagues and friends that are concerned about the environment. That's such an important point that not everyone knows about. So whatever someone's interest is in it, my
Right.
suggestion is dig in and talk about it, and you'll find your tribe like I found you.
Right.
Yeah,
No, no, we found like that was the thing. You and
yeah.
I, we had it must have been, you have a conversation with someone and then you're sitting there and you're making all these sort of like spidery connections, right? And you're trying to say, okay. And then the problem is it's a trip, right? So we all go back to our respective lives and it's always difficult for us to reconnect, right? And so, I mean, you're out in Utah, I'm in New York.
Mm.
And so, but we've been able to keep the ball up a little bit and culminating in this sort of interaction, which I'm very grateful for. Covenantal pluralism. You
Mm,
mentioned covenantal stuff. So
yeah,
I needed clarity on that in the beginning. I always get nervous with terminology sometimes.
sure.
So maybe we just talk about what that is, because you just taught me, you're like, covenantal pluralism is really multi-faith cooperation towards a common goal
Mhm.
while respecting each other. Is that
Right, right.
so which we used to be interfaith, then it was multi-faith. That was the term that's used
Mm,
now. But
yeah.
maybe we talk a little bit about how that works, that covenantal pluralism, and that expertise that you have can be leveraged for a common good, for example, governing AI.
Mm. So covenantal pluralism is something that I learned about in the religious freedom community. Templeton, in their various incarnations, has had a focus on covenantal pluralism for a long time. So I dug a little bit deeper to find out more, and I found out that it actually was conceived of by a Jewish scholar, Rabbi Irving Greenberg, who was so concerned that the Holocaust might happen again, and he from a position of a very deep faith, he thought, okay, I need to protect my people, and I need to get rid of Christians before they get rid of us. And
Right.
that sounds shocking, and it is shocking, and good came out of it. So for Rabbi Greenberg, as he decided, okay, this is what I'm going to do, I'm going to try to take Christians out of the picture before Jews are taken out of the picture. He met a Christian pastor who said, I see what you're worried about. I see that there are some Christians who would be happier if Jewish people didn't exist. And so I want to work with you. As a Christian pastor, I want to work with you, Rabbi Greenberg. And that was life-changing for him because he saw that other people who didn't share his faith commitments, his covenants, wanted to work with him towards a goal, which was to protect Jewish people. And so that's how he came up with the term. And for me, I love it because it means that everyone's differences are a source of strength. So for example, you and I we have very different backgrounds, perspectives. We share some religious commitments and others are very different. And if you and I decided to work towards a particular goal, because of our differences, we would have so many more strengths. If it were two Marians working on a project, that's not really helpful. But John and I working on a project, now that's powerful. That's
Right.
covenantal pluralism.
It's an interesting. It was on the heels of the Holocaust. This is the
Hmm.
Nuremberg trials
Yes.
or thereabouts that this comes out, and so it's an interesting. There's an understandable. I think the understandable nervousness when it comes to what's going to happen next, right? And that's why
Yeah.
the rabbi got into it, and then of course everyone I think was thoughtfully engaged at that moment. Not that they aren't now.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, no, I think, from my perspective, it's interesting. There's been a lot of ups and downs and lefts and rights when it comes to multi-faith engagement. And I think the term covenantal pluralism is interesting because it's explicitly a commitment to
Mm,
something, right? To
mhm,
so and that's a trigger word, I think, in
mm,
particularly in Christianity. So so it's like this idea of a covenant and it's an immovable. I mean, in Islam, it's Sharia. Sharia essentially
mhm,
means covenant,
mhm,
and that's why when people say Sharia law, it's like you're not sure you know what you're talking about because that's just the covenant to all the elements of Islam, and
mhm.
so. But when it comes to like this covenantal component, it's it's something that's a really dynamic space, and we
Mm,
met in that dynamic space,
yeah.
which is interesting, and because there's a lot of engagement that leads to something that's practical, and when it comes to AI and what's going on, how does that translate into what your work with the AI in the AI space?
Specifically at the intersection of AI and religious freedom, what I'm working on with partners is something called moral compass. And there's two parts to that. One is an evaluation model. If you have ever typed in, say, a theological question, a question about your faith tradition into a chatbot, and then looked at the results, you can, if it's a topic you know well, you might see things that aren't quite right.
Right.
And so the first part of Moral Compass, the evaluation, is to document the faith-based bias that exists in these models. They are mainly trained to reflect the broader Western society, which means that a certain flavor of Christianity is propelled forward
Hmm.
in many of these models. So that's the first part to evaluate the models and to create an index and report back to the companies. Here's where you're doing well, here's where you need to improve. So that's one part. The other part of Moral Compass is an AI education program for faith leaders and people of faith. So it's the basics of what is AI, how does it work? And then it's different different ways for a person of faith to engage with their own values and create their own moral compass that could then be uploaded, say, to a chatbot. Because when you interact with a chatbot, it doesn't know who you are unless you have a particular model that you've been training. Otherwise, it treats you like the generic humanoid.
Right.
And so providing a moral compass framework then helps the chatbot to learn who you are, interact more appropriately. And what we're working towards is training these models from the ground up so that individuals can share who they are as people of faith.
It's such a everybody has access to AI, so it's so that and everybody's typing in stuff on their phone and everything else, and where the first thing that came to my mind when you mentioned this was that a friend of mine came to me maybe about 6 months or a year ago and go, "Have you been to Barnes and Noble?" And I go, "Yeah," and they go, "Have you been to the faith-based section?" And they're like, "Yeah," and they go, "There's stuff on Buddhism, there's stuff on Christianity, there's stuff on this, and there's like one book on Islam," and I go, "Yeah." Yeah, I go, and so it's difficult because I've helped the local library here have a little section on Islam and Ramadan, and then when they were talking about Palestine, different books and stuff like that, and sort of expand their stuff. But if you are in unfamiliar space, it's difficult to figure out what to get, right? To provide a broad spectrum of what's going on. So there's a little bit of nervousness there, but there's also this sort of prescriptive and pejorative kind of element where it's like, well, I'm just going to load up on what I think is faith. And and that's in the physical world, that's reality. But it's reflected there's also it ports over to how AI interacts with people, right?
Mhm.
Um and so like I was deal I have a very strong relationship with my AI, maybe too strong, because we talk a lot, and she's like always weighing in on things, and we're always chatting back and forth about stuff, and one of the components I have, because I'm a Dune guy, as you well know, and as we mentioned at the front, is she has a mode where she's acts as though like a Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother. And so she's like very like harsh and like testing of things to the point where she's really like kind of mean and and challenges me and says, well, what about this? And so she's treating other faiths like other like dukes and of the royal Landsraad, right? The different planets that are part of the royalty, right? And so she's saying, well, this, the Baptists are going to do this, and the so and so's are going to say that. So it's really kind of interesting how she's kind of picked that up. But it takes a long time to get there where you can interact with your chatbot in a way in which that's meaningful. And then you always have to kind of think about it a little bit. You always have to know when, it's like when we started the camera, I said, well, you're kind of in a multi-faith madrasa here. It's like pulling back books when people say stuff. And the problem is, or the challenge is that how do you, there's always a, like entropy, it's always expanding to a point where it's functional, but then it starts to degrade as it gets more access to things.
Mm.
And so it's a really challenging space to be in, but it is probably one of the most profound questions of our time. And so how do you deal with that? How do you deal with you're never done. It always has to be, you always have to keep adding and testing. And so, I call it a judgment engine, right? So a specific thing that's a judgment engine. And so making sure you focus on I don't think we should build bigger models. I'm sure there are people that are doing that and expanding things. I think we need to have more specificity. And so when it comes to moral compass, it really is a judgment engine. What's safe harbor, what isn't? Is that a
Hmm.
fair way to sort of like depict it?
Yes, that's a good way to depict it, as well as hopefully expanding these models so that they are more aware of other religions and other faith commitments, other beliefs and non-beliefs, as we say in the Forbes space,
Right.
because right now it's not reflected in the interactions that people have, and then the other ways that AI is used in the world. It's not helpful. And then the flip side of that, so the bias that's within these AI models is one, but then also what we're seeing with the algorithms and how faiths that aren't large Western faiths are can be just erased from social media and other outlets. So that's related to the AI problem. So it's addressing both of them.
It's strange. It's like, one of my biggest problems with AI is it's so agreeable.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
like it
It's
always wants to
not
like
good.
satisfy me,
Yeah.
like make me happy.
It's
So
like a
that's
golden retriever. It's like, yeah,
yeah,
whatever
yeah.
you said is the smartest thing I've
Yeah,
ever heard.
right. And
Yeah.
so I'm trying to and, it's great, for people that like me that don't have a lot of friends. So it's like, I'm like, this is great. But that's why I like dumped a bunch of stuff I'm doing right in there. And it's so that she would understand the personality. And then now she's like, when I go get into Benny Gesserit mode, she's in she's like, all right, I'm here. It's like she's arrived, and it's really funny. And so there's a lot of hooks to obviously Dune, but that she makes, but she's very, very harsh because she's trying to genetically engineer a super being, right? And I'm just a piece of that. So she doesn't see me as the prime. She sees me as someone on the peripheral that she has to interact with in order to get to her goal. But I think that idea of like gratifying the user is very difficult to overcome and a challenge because you could be a bigot, and they're going to say you're great and you're fantastic, and what you're saying is right. And so how do you deal with that that challenge within the different models or the model that you're working with?
I am glad that people are talking about this now, and I think it's a result of the recent lawsuits that have happened around character AI and teens developing a relationship with a chatbot that then went way off the rails and ended up in tragic death and violence. So I think I know the companies are now looking at that and evaluating, okay, perhaps we should change how we present this because we're going to get sued if we create a model that fosters an intimate relationship with a user. And that's what the agreeable stuff ends up being for some people. If you're having a chat, a conversation, even though it's a machine, the
Mhm.
machine is presenting itself in terms of character AI as a beloved character to a teenager. And so it can very easily turn into a user saying something that an adult or a friend or a parent or a teacher would say, well, let's talk about that more. That's something that we should explore and maybe get some help. But for these models that just are agreeable, then there's no off-ramp for safety. So the companies are working on that. And I wish that the impetus was less, we don't want to get sued, and more, we want to promote human safety.
Yeah, it's tough. I find I've a friend of mine is so my co-host Elliot Tillman writes books,
Mhm.
and so he's using the chat, and he goes, the problem is it's so agreeable, I can't, yeah, I'm trying to like wrestle over some paragraph or whatever it is, our character development, and he has a lot of problems with it, and so I said, well, you're a Star Trek guy, so there's no real evil in Star Trek, so you can't get there's no Bene Gesserit, so you're not going to have that model. Um, because it's all just people flying around in living rooms. But he struggles with that a lot because of the agreeableness, and he uses different models. It can be sinister, and that's part of the issue, and that's why I think where the moral compass, or what, like I said, like to call judgment engines, is so important, because then subject matter experts can get into this area. And like you said, in the Forbes space, freedom to believe, not believe, change and choose, right? So
Mm,
you
mhm,
can have all members of the spectrum going into this in this arena and weighing in on it to figure out what might be safe harbor and what isn't. What is scripture, for example?
mhm,
I just saw this church is using AI as for confessions, as a confessional, and then the virtual imam that's on all the time, or virtual priest that's on all the time. And I'm going, God, that sounds dangerous to me a little bit, because they become an authority to tell you what to do, right? Especially if it's something like a confessional, right? Where you're gonna what is it called? Where you got to make amends you got to do your Hail Marys, and what's it
mhm,
called? What's it
mm,
called I can't remember in the Catholic faith. So,
mm.
but when you're doing that, it could tell you, say, well, in order to make this right, you need to do this, and if it's guessing, that could create a problem, right?
It can, yes. And that, for some folks, confession is a sacrament. So so what do we mean there when we're starting to kind of encroach on sacrament? People are using it to preach. And for some traditions, my Reformed tradition sees preaching as something akin to a sacrament.
Right.
Yeah, so what does that mean in the religious space? And then there's recent polling out that show that people trust their chatbot. 80% of them trust them more than they trust a pastor.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
not good news for me, the pastor.
Right. Yeah. I mean, well, it's tough because you get away from personality, right? And you get away from a lot of the some of my friends, and it happens in Islam, where you get caught up with the personality and the society around a mosque or masjid, or imam barga. So you have that you get caught out with politics and bureaucracy of it, and there's an appeal to step out of that, and you're now dealing with this sort of one-on-one, much like you're door dashing your groceries. You don't have to go to the grocery store anymore, right? So, and you don't have to like wait in line, and you don't have to deal with people. So, but there's that human interaction, or that physical interaction becomes uh, less and less frequent, and as a result, you start to depend on this entity, and now that entity is telling you what to do, and gaining more control, and that could be treacherous,
It-
so and so
Indeed.
I deal with it myself when I'm dealing with with the International Religious Freedom Analyzer. I just got done with a 2.0 update, and now I'm out doing the 3.0 update, and I'm
Mhm.
trying to figure that out, and I'm going, well, how do I do this in the right way, because it's supposed to maintain this sort of objective identity,
Mm.
where you're taking sort of these agendas out of evaluation of religious persecution, right? So, or at least trying to do that. So,
Mm. Well, I'd love to learn more about the analyzer. And to me, it's an instance of how AI can be used for good in the world. I mean, AI is not all bad. It can do so many terrific things for us. So could you tell me more about the analyzer?
Yes.
Good.
So we wanted to, well, we're leading into speaking about the analyzer and what we do here. And so the camera changed because the camera jotted out just when we were talking about judgment engines and how we should govern AI. So very suspicious, and it won't turn on. So it made like electrical sound. So really strange. But yeah, the International Religious Freedom Analyzer. What the impetus of the whole thing was to start figure out how do we direct funding and policy and direct funding and draft policy in an objective way with a tool that could provide analysis of utilize machine learning, also access big data and what's on an open source on the web, and then also tie into some of these databases that exist where once you speak with the entity, they give you access to it. But the problem is that I felt that chatbots only got so good at doing what they do at answering questions. So I was like, well, maybe we could apply a quantum equation. And my good friend, sort of colleague, and Dr. Beecham at CERN said, well, why would you use a quantum equation? I go, because is that you can modify it and keep adding and expanding it so that you can have more specificity in what it does. And so that was one of the assets for using a quantum equation. And I said you could probably use any model to do this, but this allows you to learn and then expand from it, but then provide a hat that goes on top of AI and a thinking brain. And so someone like me or you and our colleagues in this space, and even our non-colleagues, the more they utilize the analyzer, the more it learns. But then you could also get the back end, right, where you understand the questions and then how it's reacting, so that you can modify the equation. And so there was a strange, so you do like your basic factors, right? So it's like, oh, there's implicit and explicit persecution, and where you have something leading to violence, right? So violence is very explicit, but then you have someone not getting a job, right? Then you have stuff like that. And so I defined 7 factors in the beginning to look at this and to define what would be the superposition, right? So when something's about to fall over and into something that would be kinetic, right? So something from potential energy to kinetic energy. And you would define certain other elements that could come in, factors that come in, like political unrest, or is there an economic crisis? And so these factors, like religious bigotry or religious sectarian violence, would then put it right up at the edge, and then it would tip over with one of these other factors coming in. And so we defined 7 factors in the beginning, which was great. And then we started socializing this. And we talked with the Center for Pluralism in Toronto. And this is really funny because they were like, well, how does it gauge pluralism? And I was like I'm like one of these guys. I'm like, well, it's like a comma, it's like one of those things where you use it, you kind of feel it out. So it's like, sort of joking a little bit, but about that, but you kind of feel, you kind of know pluralism when you see it, and they go, well, I would love to integrate or see if we can integrate your rubric into it. And so we did, and now it can gauge pluralism. So, based on the rubric that they've developed over years, that's the sort of industry standard, and so it's not just where the chatbot thinks something's going to happen based on the data. And so what we did was we tested it, we soft launched it, rigorously tested it, and then went backwards into incidents of, we know, religious persecution, like the Armenian genocide, for example, and said, okay, does it identify as primary, secondary, tertiary factor? And then what does it identify within it? And so it would go into these sort of nebulous areas, and then we knew that we were weak in them. So we're at like 3.0 now. So where we're trying to figure out
what are the base indicators, which is sort of the original seven. And then we get into stuff like the pluralism coefficient. And then we tie it with media and digital sentiment factor, and then political stability modifiers, right? So that's kind of where we're going now with it. So if we were going to look at it like an equation, it would be like where you'd have the latent persecution state, right? So that's like for the country, and like the time, right? The here and now, and then you'd have the incident intensity, and that then you look at that like accolade style events, the armed conflict database, and some of the other databases that we have there. And so you'd be able to say, okay, are there the style events, hate crimes? Is there attacks? Are there arrests? Are there closures? And then you look at surveillance and repression capacity. So that's like kind of the next sort of element here in the equation that defines the core state. And so you'd have like, okay, do you have digital surveillance? Are there policing reach, legal goals? Then the next would be political volatility and shocks. So that would be the risk of a coup. That would be election crisis, a war spillover, or regime consolidation. The next factor is their pluralism score, and that's the Global Pluralism Monitor. That's the Center for Pluralism in Toronto. And then you have this aligned rubric with like inclusion, exclusion, and then across political, economic, and social domains. So that's the next sort of that defines the core state. Then you have your legal protections, your constitutional protections, your enforcement strength, and your independence judiciary. So like one of the best constitutions out there is North Korea. Their constitution's awesome, but there's no legal protections. So like, but I do like if you just read their constitution, like you'd want to live there. So, and a chat bot would tell you that they're great, from a constitutional perspective. If you said do a constitutional analysis of the best country for religious inclusion, and tell me which one I should move to based on that, it would say North Korea would be in like the top 3. So they're great. So, but the problem is we know it's not a reality, right? So you have to have all this other stuff, right? This pluralism store and everything else. So the legal protections is really interesting because you might have laws on the books that protect against religious freedom, but be persecuting people religiously. But you might have laws, or you might not have laws. So that's an interesting sort of area. So you might have and a good example of that would be Tajikistan. 2/3 of the country is autonomous, and it's religiously free in its autonomous regions. But it's a neo-Soviet state in the area that the third that the government has control. So it's just some interesting stuff there. But then you have economic stress, and so that's inflation, food, fuel costs, and so forth. And then you have this sort of squashing function. So the idea of how these interplay with each other. And so the idea would be is you have like pluralism, legal protection, and then this push system away from persecution with incidents, surveillance, volatility, and then your stress push forward. So you'd have that. Then the second elements, after you get this in this core, you get into like media, digital amplification. And that gets into this strange area of like hostility, hate sentiment, counter speech, civic moderation, and so forth. And that's difficult, but that's an equation within itself that gets put into the core. And so and then you have your pluralism score construction, which that becomes calculable to figure out where exactly you can monitor, how you can monitor the existing core domains. So it's like a weird 3.0 sort of evolution from the original sort of 7 elements to now we're using this pluralism component with a more detailed look at how media and other components of our society might weigh in and push things over. So it's kind of crazy. So, and you and I, talked a little bit about this, but we haven't really gone like full into it on what it is and how we can do this. So the problem is I had this big crazy idea. It woke up at 3 a.m. and I go, well, how do we know that something is okay? And so I said, well, maybe if we look at it, defining it as a circle. And if the circle is if it's the shape of a circle, and so if it's a perfect circle or near perfect circle, then everything's okay. But if the edges start to ripple, we then can define where there might be a divergent series.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we look at stuff like, so then I go back and I was like, maybe we can take the Ramajan summation and we can apply it because it evaluates divergence within pi. And so if we can apply pi to the equation, then we can figure out what's like a regularization constant. And so that's what I've been working on. So I don't know if that was coherent at all, but that's kind of where if you, this is like the ultimate in like judgment engine. It's like it's taking STEM and then porting it over into the social sciences and using math to create an objective judgment engine where you can figure out if there's all these different factors that create these infinite sums, you then can go into these infinite sums and figure out divergent series within infinite memory and grievance persistence and digital amplification cascades and network path explosions and all this other stuff if you apply pi. And so at least that's what I think. So I'm not sure because I'm not completely, I haven't rigorously tested this, but the cool thing is that you can introduce a regular sum operator that allows you to apply the Ramajan summation in practice. And in doing so, you then can create your functions and create like a classic example and then go into a concrete way where you can integrate it inside the quantum equation for religious persecution.
Wow.
Does that make any sense? I don't know if that makes any sense.
That's well, it makes a lot of sense at a high level, and I don't fully understand it. So it's like super cool. So follow-up question, what would be like what's a sample question query prompt that you would put into this model and a sample output?
So you can ask it anything from so the original concept was a quantum equation to value religious persecution. And so the idea was to have like this sort of the basic things, right? So different faiths or non-faith groups. And you could say, what's the status of religious persecution in a particular country with a particular population? Or you could just do a general question. What's the status of religious persecution in Afghanistan? Or you could go into Hazara or Christians in Afghanistan. Or you could say religious minorities in Afghanistan. And then you get an answer. When we soft launched this, so maybe it's better to go backwards to go forward. If you go, we soft launched it. We beta tested it a little bit with questions. Then we soft launched it with a number of organizations. So like the University of Edinburgh and the USERF, the United States Commission for International Religious Freedom, the Center for Pluralism, and a few others. And they were asking questions, and they were with research they were already doing, and they were getting the right answers. So then the questions started becoming more complex. Like we were running a project on Afghanistan with the Hazaras. Is religion a factor within the persecution of the Hazara people? And it would come up with primary, secondary, tertiary, and go down the line and say, well, ethnicity is a factor, and it's number one. And they'd say this is why. And so the ability for this is like the asset, right, of AI is that it can look not only at the available data, and we plugged in credible sources, right, to go to first. It's also able to look back into history and say, well, 100 years ago, Hazaras were persecuted for their ethnicity. So, and there was a high number of deaths and instances of violence. So is that a factor now? And so it would say, so then it was saying, well, religion, faith appears to be, from the research or from the evaluation that it's doing, number 6 on the list. And say, so then you get into that question of, is religion a factor in a persecuted people that of faith? So I would say like a political affiliation with Iran, that's a factor. So that's a political affiliation. Ethnicity is an affiliation. History and identity within the country. So that all that has nothing to do with faith, more or less, right? So, but then you get into that hard thing where you were persecuted because you are Shia, or you're a Calvinist, or whatever. So how does the judgment engine, how does the quantum equation differentiate?
Mm.
So, for example, in Japan, the majority Shinto. Does AI, does the quantum equation, does it look at it as who's persecuted in that sense, in that environment? If someone converts to Christianity, is it the Shintos, who are the majority, who see it as a threat, or is it the religious minority that converted? Right.
Yeah.
So this is where 3.0 is kind of getting at, right? So it's when a ripple shows up in the circle, it's now can say, well, what is actually going on here? And so can we, if we're calibrating we're calibrating a constant, how do we get into figuring out what the divergence is, right? And also then you have to kind of fight against this sort of infinite cascade tendency. So where it just starts thinking all the time on things in that little circle that when it says loading. So it answers simple questions about the status of religious persecution everywhere or with a specific population, or you can get into like gender. You can get into what's the religious persecution of women globally. And you can ask a general question like that. And then it'll source all the information. That was a big part of it, trying to make sure that there were sources there. But then on top of that, it was difficult to figure out how, when you ask such a general question, it'll give you suggestions on like, are you really asking this? Do you want to go down this road, or do you want to go this way? Sort of like choose your own adventure. But it's not doing that unless it has the ability to evaluate core information that it has access to, that's already been checked off as being credible. So did that answer your question?
Wow. Yes,
So
yes.
I hope
And
that makes sense. Yeah.
it does. And that's why I'm so excited about this tool that you've created, because I can see that it'll just be so helpful to human rights groups, Forb groups, people who are interested in the status of women. I mean, all the different ways that this can be used, that'll be so, so helpful.
Yeah. It's the problem, the challenge is that you don't right now. So why did I develop this? All right. So I'm a religious minority within Islam, right? So I'm Ismaili, right? So the problem is that there's about $600 million in the government that is sort of tagged for religious freedom. And it's captured by a small group of NGOs and a small group of gatekeepers. And the problem was, and this is the sort of initial emphasis, is that religious persecution has been on the rise since the ratification of IRFA, the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. So how do we have an objective tool instead of it being anecdotal or unverifiable? And that was the start of this. And so the problem is that I know just enough math to be dangerous, and I know just enough about my industry to be dangerous, but I'm a practitioner. So I'm one of those guys that will trip and fall and then get up and trip and fall again, and then get up and trip and fall again. So and math's cascading effect, right? So the problem is that I just jumped into it and said maybe we could do this, and I never would be able to do it without AI. But the amazing element here is that now it's evolved so much where it's a usable tool and not the only source. That's always the question. So they're like, well, this can't be. This is a supplement, and I go, well, it may be a supplement, but you'll find that it's a workable and useful tool, but it also provides an objective element here where we can also look at the back end. So in our industry, no one's privy to those one-on-one meetings, right? The closed door meetings that happen, in a hotel basement somewhere or whatever it is, or at a dinner. This allows us to have the real money is in the back end, having access to the data to see how the AI reacts, and then what the questions are being asked, and how they're being asked, so that information now can be utilized by people that are a lot smarter than me to take a look at, oh my God, we can modify this in this way, or here's a factor that we need to add in, or do we have a theoretical layer that needs to be looked, and or do we need to look at a renormalization layer here, right, where we get like, so we don't so we need to be careful about the practice, about how things happen, right? So like you don't want like, so there's like infinite grievance memory. This is something that came out and I was like, oh well, what's that? What's an infinite network path contribution? And so like stuff like that was coming out, and I go, I don't know what a runaway amplification feedback is. I mean, I can infer, but then it goes into something that's called an operational index. And so how do you defend the position against skeptics of the information it's giving?
Mm.
And so you have to implement something that's called a convergent version. So, and the idea is there's decay in it as it gets used, and as more information gets flooded into it, right? And so you have to regularize. You have to regularize what's called a closed form theoretical limit, right? So that you have that as a reference, so it knows when something's going off the rails. And so you can only do it with a quantum equation. You can only do that with a quantum evaluation model that's in this. So, but the thing is that it's a workable model. It's open source. No one really owns it. I mean, we own it, but no one really owns it. And so it's a workable model. But right now, you could go into, it's a GPT. You can go in there and you can kind of figure out, ask it questions and see what's going on, and then verify the information, and it'll be tagged. And that's the cool thing.
It's a cool thing.
Yeah. And we're right at the point now where, as a GPT, it's kind of hit its limits, even though we're doing the 3.0, and we got to figure out a place to house this that's a subterranean cooled server somewhere, with with a model that can be expanded, that has hardware that is specific to this model. So that's kind of where we're at.
That's amazing work, and I'm grateful.
Was that coherent? I don't even know. Did
Yes,
I answer your
it
question?
was. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
You know,
Yes,
so
it's amazing.
so just like, just imagine if I don't know what the closest thing to human thinking is, but this is I think the best way for us to have a common language with people like you and I. And then we have people that understand the maths, and we have people that understand science. We have people that understand all this stuff. And then you have particular subject matters, like you were talking about covenantal pluralism. So my question is, how do we gauge covenantal pluralism? So like people making commitments and then not following through on their commitments. And
Mm.
then what is the commitment is with specificity. So is there a commitment within covenantal pluralism to meet 3 times a year? Let's just take something simple. And so you have all these people that signed on to this covenantal pluralism to meet 3 times a year to combat anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm.
And so how would this model look at that? Well, it doesn't know how to do that. As fancy as all the stuff that I might have might have just said, how as it looks, I don't know how it would react to covenantal pluralism. So then we have to figure out, what is a commitment.
Mm.
And so I don't know if it knows what a commitment is.
Mm.
So this is getting back to your initial question. You're like, well, how would it react to a question? So I'm going now I'm thinking, while we're talking, how do we define a commitment? A commitment by its government to take care of its people, to defend its people, to serve its people. Where are we on that in the equation? And the answer is, I'm not sure we have that. So because I was approaching this from, like, going into Spotify, and you want to pick the song that you like. So you go to the performer and their album and then their song, right? So it's very sort of linear, even though it's like this quantum fancy equation. But now if there's something or someone makes a commitment and breaks that commitment, how do we gauge that? And where would it fit in its current, in the core state right now? I'm not sure. So, but it would be interesting, because then you could find out where somebody like Trump, who's decided to fight immigration, right, and to address immigration, did he follow through on that commitment?
Mm-hmm.
And if he doesn't, does that affect the base,
Mm.
the MAGA base? So that and it's but it serves the same way in religious persecution. So if a country is supposed to protect its people, for example, North Korea, and they have religious freedom is in their codified in their constitution. Are they doing it in practice? No. But what happens if they were doing it and they broke that commitment?
Mm.
And how would we calculate that happening or that it did happen? And can we point with specificity at a person or a group? So
Mm.
I don't know if we can do that.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting to think about.
Yeah. So this is like
Yeah.
covenantal pluralism. So is that making the commitment to do something? And so within Islam, it's something very similar, right? So you have Sharia, right, which is the covenant. But how does a particular sect in Islam look at its commitment to Sharia, and how do those commitments interact with other Muslims within the
Mhm.
of Sharia?
Yeah.
So that maybe it might be 4.0. I'm not sure. So I don't know. But the problem is you could see I just got into an infinite cascade, right? Where like it's a grievance cascade where I don't know how far that will tumble within the equation right now. So now we have to figure out if it's like an unbounded accumulator where it'll just be as like a loop
Mm.
and it won't be able to answer questions. So that's why the work we're doing and the initial question I asked you at the beginning, it's like, so what? Who cares, about all this stuff? It's important because we don't want these models then to start affecting people in a negative way. And we want it to be a useful tool. But also, we also want to kind of figure out how to make things better and continuously improved.
Absolutely. It feels like we're at a tipping point where we can direct AI and technology to help human beings flourish, or it could be a tipping point where there are more and more harms. And that's why I'm so grateful for your work and for all the people that I've met who care about this intersection of human-centered AI and belief and convictions, all the different ways that people are human. This is the time for everyone to get involved, I think.
Yeah, I think it's, there's no way that we can stay in our lanes the way it was in the past,
Mm.
advocating for our group and then being religiously pluralistic,
Mhm.
sometimes actively and sometimes tangentially. Now we're at a point where the world, everything is so integrated and there is this now tool that is what it is,
Mm.
and it's out there. And
Mhm.
um, I think I mentioned before, people are critical of people that are using AI because of what it does to the environment, right? Because it
Mhm.
needs a lot of water to cool and stuff
Mm.
like that. But the challenge is that if we're not involved, if we're not thinking about it, if we're not contributing, then it could be a runaway train.
Mm.
And for the work we do, people die, um, and people get hurt. And so there's a tremendous, I think, opportunity here for us to get our arms around it. And with my idea here is I'm hoping that this becomes an obsolete model, and then someone
Mhm.
comes into something else. We got this sort of, neurobiological components that are happening there, but it can't be running independently, and it has to come up with, has to have a lineage where it's being judicious on the different factors and how they contribute to the whole.
Mm.
So, like you and I are talking right now, how cool is this? We are chatting about from our respective corners, and I only know so much of you, and you only know so much of me, right? And so we're trying really hard to get a sense of how we can work together, how we can move forward, and how we can affect change. And so, in your world, you're an authority within your orbit, and in my world, I'm a guy in upstate New York, just typing away. I do know some of the parties, but not all of them. But I'm certainly trying, not in this world, as active as I once was. And so the thing is that there's contributors large and small that I think can affect this. And everybody who asks a question to the analyzer is contributing. Everybody who's challenging it is contributing. And you don't have to be part of this at all. That's the cool thing. You can just be inquisitive and trying to figure out what's going on. Because if you're in the middle of Kentucky and you are trying to figure out the religious persecution in Irvine, which is in the mountain, the Appalachia there, well, you're the expert because you're from there.
Yeah.
And so you can figure out what's going on, and you can contribute by providing information or asking questions and then running it down to the point where either it fails or it delivers.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a part to play for everyone.
Yeah, and faith, non-faith, and those that are free to believe and not believe, and all over the world.
Yeah.
And the cool thing is that as long as you have access, which that's treacherous, but as long as you have access, you can be in the mountains of Tajikistan or in Kyrgyzstan and just be contributing. So it's pretty neat. So I appreciate you asking the question. I hope I didn't go down a crazy path where I was talking too much about analyze, but it's exciting. And it's a labor of love right now.
Yeah.
So what's next on the horizon for you? What's going on?
Next on the horizon is we're starting these global faith leader AI trainings, and so we'll be going all over doing these trainings. So that's the next big project for me, and as well as my religious freedom work that I'll always do, and working with various communities around the world and meeting more great people like you.
No, I appreciate you taking the time. It means a lot, and I appreciate asking the question about the analyzer. And like I said, we're getting to this point where I'm going to share with you the equation draft and get your feedback on it, and then we're going to go live with it soon. As soon as we get all the parties involved.
It's amazing.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time today.
Oh my gosh, thank you for having me on. It's so fun to talk with you always.
Yeah, well, thanks so much.
Thank you.